I'm Dr Katharine Wright of Newcastle University, and I'm going to be giving a brief overview of the research I've done along with Professor Toni Haastrup of Stirling University and Professor Roberta Guerrina of Bristol University on women, peace and security and its relevance in the UK context. This research and research base has fed into the report and dossier we produced for the Newlines Institute on a review of the UK's new National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which was published in February 2023. And we really focus on the progress that has been made in terms of domestication. The UK is not the first state to do this, but is showing some kind of welcome progress here. And in terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to be structuring it around the policy recommendations that we make in terms of how the UK government can look to most effectively implement their National Action Plan. So the first recommendation we make really builds on our research looking at how WPS has been implemented in other spaces and other countries and states, and what has kind of led it to become more effective in that way. And the US is one example here where we have the introduction of the WPS bill, which has really been instrumental in making women, peace and security not a partisan issue, but actually a bipartisan issue, and one that the state is kind of obligated to implement in its day-to-day activities. And this we feel is something really key in the UK context to supporting the domestication of women, peace and security more systematically, and ensuring that the UK lives up to the obligations set out in the NAP. It's also a way of ensuring kind of funding for the NAP kind of obligations. So we have the kind of private members bill going through Parliament at the moment, and really kind of support for this and legislating on WPS is one positive move the UK could make to further implement women, peace and security. The other aspect is really ensuring that the NAP and the implementation of the NAP are kind of fit for purpose in terms of how the UK works across the four nations. So we very much recommend that the Foreign Office and perhaps the Home Office work together to map what women, peace and security means across the four nations, because it's going to mean something very different in Northern Ireland compared to Wales, England and Scotland. And this should include consideration of how it should be integrated into their kind of distinct gender regimes, and to ensure policy coherence. And this is something that the devolved governments, legislatures and also local civil society should feed into, in order to ensure that this is kind of a fit for purpose consultation. The other aspect that's important here is actually kind of raising awareness of what women, peace and security means across the four nations. So we have different levels of understanding of women, peace and security across civil society. We have a particular kind of knowledge concentration, perhaps unsurprisingly in London, but actually we need to widen that knowledge base among civil society in order to make sure that when the UK government is consulting civil society, that civil society kind of has sufficient kind of knowledge level and understanding of what it means in their context to best support the UK. And part of this, and diversifying into policymaking and implementation among civil society, is actually funding civil society's participation and engagement. It's great that the UK has quite an extensive consultation process on its NAP, but in order to diversify participation across the implementation stage and also the consultation and evaluation process, the UK government, the Foreign Office needs to be providing funding for civil society groups to be coming to London from the various nations, but also the Foreign Office needs to be going out to the different nations, to England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and talking to them on their own kind of terms on what women, peace and security means. The other aspect is really we see an opportunity for the UK to make the most of some of the advances it's made in relation to women, peace and security and defence. So the UK is in many ways kind of leading the way here in terms of how it's innovating and seeking to implement WPS in relation to defence. The new NAP has a very strong section and set of commitments for the Ministry of Defence, and this we think is something positive, even if there are some particular areas which need development, such as giving some kind of thought to how we're going to meet this 30% recruitment of women into the armed forces by 2030, which is a very ambitious goal. But one of the areas where, and the NAP talks about this, is it talks about the UK taking a leadership role within NATO. We would actually say this needs to be more specific. So in relation to defence, on the military side of NATO, the key actor here is the NATO Committee on Gender Perspectives, which was the Committee on Women in NATO Forces. The UK has been a real kind of key actor here since it was founded. And today, the committee provides a very essential advisory function to the Military Committee on WPS. So this is a real way for the UK to kind of influence NATO and other NATO nations on how it does WPS in relation to defence. The other aspect is the committee also shares reports, and there's an annual meeting where lessons of best practice in relation to WPS and defence are shared, and this is a chance not only for the UK to share its own lessons, but also to learn from others. The other area is very much kind of developing a strategy for dealing with cyber and online security. So we found, this was kind of hinted at within the NAP, and within the UK's kind of separate approach to dealing with cyber security, kind of gender aspects are hinted at. But there's perhaps kind of a lack of joined up thinking here. And we think part of the reason for this is actually the growth of digital violence and insecurity is something that remains kind of under research and perhaps under not really understood. So it's difficult to translate what that would look like in policy. So this is an area where more investment is needed to understand WPS commitments and what they look like in relation to cybersecurity, but they are certainly there. The other aspect, so one of the challenges of the UK NAP was it speaks a lot about women. It is the Women, Peace and Security agenda after all. But the Women, Peace and Security agenda is very much kind of a starting point for broader conversations on gender, peace and security, and this is how we've seen it evolve as a global gender norm. And there were some kind of difficulties within the NAP. So the inclusion of LGBTQ was promising, but actually it wasn't included in the best way. And actually I think more needs to be done to think about kind of inclusive ways for including LGBTQ people within the provisions of the NAP, because there's certainly a place for them. And also talking about kind of men and masculinities. And so we argue that by shifting towards gender, peace and security, we create a space that moves away from rarefying gender binaries to actually a new way of thinking about kind of gender norms and how they shape insecurity. And part of this is actually a purposeful move away from thinking about women just as victims. And we understand kind of there is a difficult aspect of kind of marrying together the participation and the protection element of women, peace and security, but the protection element is necessary for the participation of women. And this goes back again to cyber, and actually you can't talk about protection without talking about participation and women's agency. So Roberta, Toni and I have been working on women, peace and security in the UK context, in the NATO context, in the EU context, and beyond for quite a few years now. And this is just a sample of some of the wider research that went into and informed our thinking on the dossier for the Newlines Institute. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, then please do feel free to follow up. There's a link to my website there.